I'm not adventurous as some others, so I'm going to try this without the microphone first. If this doesn't work, let me know and I'll go to the mic. My name is Clair Grant, and until 2 months ago, I was the Chief Technology Officer of ESI since its inception. I retired from that job. I'm done with that. I don't do that anymore. I'm now officially a researcher, which I think Camille came up with the term. And basically, what's that mean? I work for him, and we decide whatever I can best do to help him in the company in a more limited number of hours than I used to work. So that's the story at this point. And this topic really wasn't devised by me. We were talking about the boot camp and presentations and so forth. And we got into do people really want to hear me talk about porting to x86 again? Somebody suggested maybe you ought to think about talking about all 3 ports at once and see what the history is of how we got here, how they were different, what was good, what you hated, all that sort of stuff. So what I'm trying to do today is get across how different from the internal view that I had of all 3 of these ports compared to what you probably see on the outside, as in, okay, the operating system now runs on another platform. Well, how did we get there beyond just changing the code? You can't forget this. Now, we engineers always like to say, well, the sign on the building doesn't make a bit of difference. We're porting the code, leave us alone. But what happens at this level had a magnitude of what's happened to the engineers that most people never see. Yes, we went through 4 companies and it's still running. The big difference, of course, of what this means is that the resources behind the people, the money, and where we fit into the company, where we were when the port was being done. And that's a point I want to get across very well, I hope. Not only been through a bunch of companies, we went through a bunch of executives. Now, I realized I forgot to put Dave Sweeney up here, who was our interim at BSI for a while. I should have him on there, and I realized that later. Sorry. And I'll also admit, when I first made this list, I said, okay, here are the companies, here are the CEOs. I forgot to put Johan on the list. Don't tell him. But obviously, I can't tell this story without him. And I also can't tell the story without some of the interactions he and I had, because they bear heavily on the result. So, bunch of companies, bunch of CEOs. The code itself is well traveled. As most anything that started in digital years and years ago, it all started at the mill in Maynard, right? Well, then VMS moved to Tewksbury. Then all these new facilities were built in southern New Hampshire. And VMS was in Nashua for a long time. And I may say Spitbrook Road, if you don't know what that means, that's where our home was in Nashua. In my head, I could probably come close. Then code went to India. We spent, I don't know, 2-3 years maybe. Knowledge transition, we've been there before. And then we all went off and we found other jobs. A lot of people left the company. Some people stayed within tech, and so forth and so on. And then years later, lo and behold, BSI. Oh, I should say, Bangalore, we didn't just send the code. We sent our lab, the servers, everything we had went to India. It wasn't just the code on a disk or anything. We sent our lab, more or less. What we got back was the code. No equipment, most of the code, I should say. He came back first to Northborough, Mass, which was the home of mnemonics engineering. Those would be somebody you know mnemonics, right? Small company. And I want to say, and this is part of reading documents I probably wasn't supposed to, you cannot underestimate the importance that the relationship mnemonics had, digital equipment, and so forth and so on, in how BSI got the license for VMS. Now, I know this from things I probably shouldn't know. And I can also say that at that time, we were not the only people in the running to get the licenses for VMS. There were two other, and I'm going to say entities, which I'm not going to name, but there were three entities that were being considered to get VMS. And the mnemonics relationship counted. Northborough. So we're in the Northborough facility of mnemonics, little tiny place. There's 10 of us, right? I have more to say about that later. Then we go to Bolton, Mass, where we were for a number of years. Then we went to the Colo in Chelmsford. And now we're back in Northborough, but a different place. So the companies, the CEOs, the managers, the code, it's been a long road. I'm often asked which port was the hardest, among other things about the comparison. But if you've ever been around when that question was asked, you'll know that it takes me about 1/10 of a second to answer. I don't even have to think about it. It's just kind of in my head. So I tried to come up with a word for each of the ports, that the way I think about them and how I could convey to you folks what makes them different. I don't have to think about this. I mean, alpha was this hard, and Itanium was like this hard, and x86 was maybe like this hard. I mean, it's just not in the same universe. And I hope I can get that across why. Just as a starter, when we started the port to alpha, BMS engineering, and not counting the two buildings next door full of people who worked with us on various things, BMS engineering itself had more people than there are in the entire BSI company today. Itanium, also not too hard. It was different in every way, shape, or form. The way it got started, the technology, it was different. And I hope I can get that across as well. I was actually more challenged here. I took a long time before I came up with this word. But for me, as a remembrance of sorts, virtualization is the thing that will always stand out of my mind as to what we did in this port and where we're headed. So let's see if I can put some description up there. This may have nothing to do with what we're talking about today. It's something that came to my head when I was thinking about this. This little phrase might have been around for centuries. I don't know. But 15 to 20 years ago, a then US Secretary of State said these words in a very public national speech. And all of a sudden, everybody on the planet is using this phrase. So I look at the last one. The progression really here is how much of what is ahead of you a really scary thing that you're looking at, right? The more things that are near the top, the better off you are. You feel pretty good. Well, when we started porting to alpha, that bottom line, we had no clue what we were doing. And I literally mean that. I mean, this is Murphy's Law, the X factor, put them all together. We just didn't know how to start. When it came to Itanium, felt a little bit better about the last one. We've done it once. We kind of knew what we were doing. You got a new architecture. Okay, we figured out things like this before. So the last one was kind of a smaller bubble for me. And maybe a little bit of ego talking here, but when it came to x86, I honestly wasn't that worried. Technically, anyway. Okay. You have to realize that, okay, I think of starting the port in I'll call it 88. Things of alpha had started before that, but in terms of BMS engineering and us starting the port, let's call it 1988. In the middle 80s, VAX VMS had already become one of the iconic products in computer history. BMS had over 100,000 licenses, and I don't know how many more, but I know it was way up in those terms, way up there. Marketing people used to tell me they'd go around to other places in the company and they'd say, I don't care what you work on, BMS pays at least part of your salary. That's the focus that BMS was in the company and for us. We'd never done this before. The code had never been ported. But we had some parameters here. You could not disrupt this massive product out there, VMS. You couldn't do anything to that. I mean, this is what the company's livelihood almost at this point. Bit of exaggeration, but that's the way it was focused on us. We couldn't change that schedule. So engineering, and kind of rightly so, the management, they really split us into two groups. We hired new people, in fact, and there were some people, they only worked on the port to alpha. Some people only worked continuing the VAX line. There was a little bit of intermingling in there, but I'm not talking about 50-50 here. I'm talking about like 90-10 maybe. So organization got split, and you can understand management's thinking here. We've got to separate this new thing from the thing that is our livelihood. Totally understandable. However, then they decided that the code needed to be separated. You've probably heard us talk about, we build x86 VMS from common sources, Alpha, Titanium, now x86. Notice VAX is not in the picture because it's this other thing over here. You can probably tell, 35 years later, I'm still ticked off about this. But, you know, it's not like they're making roadblocks for us, but, you know, they had to be unbelievably careful here. I mean, you could upset an incredibly big apple cart. So it wasn't all bad. We did know pretty much what was coming. I mean, we know all the people. We knew the hardware designers, the CPU people, we knew everybody. All in the same company, plus we knew them anyway. VMS, in minor ways, actually contributed to design along the way, a little bit. One of the things that was, I don't know, intellectually nice to know, Alpha was being designed for multiple operating systems to run on. It wasn't just for 264. It wasn't just for VMS. It was for could be Windows, could be Linux, you name it. So that was kind of a comforting thought that there were other people in the ballgame besides just us. But it was still, as I said, this was slideware. You know, it's going to be a long time before we see a piece of hardware. The good parts. As I said, VMS, huge organization. Not only were we big, there's an organization called TLE, Technical Engineering. John, are you here? This is where all the compilers did. Actually, this is before John's introduction to working on a port. The compilers, the RTLs, the runtime libraries, and a whole bunch of other tools were all developed by this huge organization in the building next door to us. So you can add all of that to my 170, whatever I talked about in the beginning. We created some new groups, or we expanded and better defined some groups within VMS itself. In the earlier days of VMS, I'm going to say at least 10, maybe 15 years, there was no builder and booter team. An engineer got told, for the next month, you're the builder and the booter. And that's what you did. But when Alpha came along, we kind of expanded a lot of things, made a more clear definition of how they fit into the organization. And there was the build and boot team. 3, 4, maybe 5 people. They did the builds. They did the boots. They did a lot of the cleanup in the beginning before it got announced for the rest of the engineers to work on. The qual team. Did we have a qual team before this? Of course. However, we now needed an alpha quality. VMS VAX, VMS alpha. We were split. Now, they kind of overlapped more than the engineers did, but nonetheless, the definition and how QTV, as we've called it, has come to play over the years, really started there. We hadn't a clue when the first time we would ever see a piece of hardware. However, there was a simulator from the very beginning. Of course, the hardware designer people, they had something. So we knew that when we got to the point of being able to run anything, that we had a starting point without ever seeing a piece of hardware. And that was a godsend in the beginning, but it took us a long way to get there. Lots of people, lots of resources. We could have asked for anything from the company and gotten it. One of the things about Alpha, kind of the secret sauce in Alpha, is the PAL code. And if you had an operating system that was designed for VAX, like us, or you had an operating system like Unix or something else that ran on every platform on the planet anyway, you didn't need much, right? If you look at the PAL code for a Unix system, it's like this big. The PAL code for VMS is this big because it contains all those special things that are in VAX architecture that are exposed. Also had an SRM console. You've heard Gary talk about the boot manager. Here's something we didn't really have to think much about back at the beginning. We had the VAX console. That was good. Gem compiler backend. The compiler people didn't just work on VMS. This is the people next door. They didn't just work on VMS. They worked on lots of products, lots of platforms. So they had this compiler backend called Gem, and it already knew about lots of platforms in the world. So that was a head start that we had in a lot of ways.
Is there much C code in VMS at that time period?
No, but save that thought. Okay. So now we get to the hard part. What do you do about this massive pile of VAX assembly? At this point, more or less, the system is macro 32 and Bliss. Very little C in it. To tell you the truth, I can't remember where I was. Couldn't have been very much. So we're talking about macro and Bliss. What do you do with this thing? And this, by the way, was the crux of, there were some very high level people in DEC, and I mean, way up there. They said, you're never going to do this. And that was the main reason. So one of the big deals here about the macro 32 code is we're now moving to a 64-bit architecture. Every one of those registers, every one of those instructions, this used to say load along, not anymore. This is something else. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we tackled that. But that plays into the third bullet, back to the VAX VMS position in the world at that time. How do I say this? Today, you can look at VMS today and you say, what an incredible mishmash of 32-bit and 64-bit stuff. Why did anybody ever do that? Well, the answer is the bottom bullet. We could have turned VMS into a complete 100% 64-bit operating system if we wanted to, but there was a customer base out there beyond comprehension how big it was. We could not afford to take off too many of those people. That is why a lot of things are the way they are.
I had a product on Alpha that would generate that 32 code. And it didn't take long to discover that there was limitations in the Mac 32 emulator.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is that the reason we generated the Mac with output, that's the only compiler that comes standard with VMI.
Now, that's the other part of the question here. If we were to, I should say here, I didn't say this in the beginning. Back up to number one. Why did we decide to do what we did in terms of creating a compiler? We tried to think of everything possible. Do we rewrite the macro 32 code in VMS? It's gigantic, and I'm going to show you that in a minute. If we rewrote it, what would you rewrite it in? C compiler, well, no, not in those days. We didn't have anything. We had no control on anything. However, no laughing, we could have converted the whole thing to bliss. There's a lot of bliss in VMS. We knew it. Lots of people knew it. It's part of the product. But we ultimately came to the conclusion that rewriting it in anything wouldn't happen in our lifetime. That's the bottom line. So then we started talking about a compiler. Compiling assembly language, that's an oxymoron if you ever heard one. However, we had a little bit of an advantage because we had a front end, the assembler. So we had a starting point. And after that, that's when things got a little hairy. But again, we got this kind of mixture of 32-bit, 64-bit because of the customer base. We could not do too much to disrupt them because if we had gone to complete 64 bits, we knew there was a whole pile of things that would be broken and there were probably tons of things that we didn't even think of. So that's how it all happened. Okay, so what do we do with this massive piece of code? Okay, we had to add a bunch of conditionals, right? We got a new platform here. There's a small part of VMS. VMS isn't as big a piece of spaghetti as everybody thinks it is. There's a fairly small part of VMS that knows about the actual hardware platform. So conditionals, yes, did that. Now, we created macros for a whole pile of stuff, but I put these up here to represent something in particular. If you were to look at our quote unquote macro code today, it doesn't look a lot like many people's assembly language would look like because you get all this stuff all throughout it. We created an EVAX, extended VAX, instruction for every one of those things that now had to deal with a 64-bit register. Every one of those instructions. And we had to create the next 4 things up there that were routines that set you up for a call with the right registers to get to and from a call in 64 bits. I wish I had the pointer. The system,
Pointer.
well, it doesn't work, no battery.
Yes, it does work.
Oh,
but you
just
switch that.
change.
Put it back?
Yeah.
Okay. Hey, okay. Just the sys facility, one facility. Now, a lot of the kernel is in there, I'll admit that, but no network, no cluster, no device drivers, just sys has 35,000 of just those 4 calls in. Some human, some engineer went and changed every one of those lines of code to put an EVAX or a call in it, every single one of them. And I'm just talking about one facility here.
How many lines, just for reference, how many lines of code are in this?
I think I've been, I don't know. I probably looked 10 years ago because I always get this question. Someday I should probably figure it out. Not easy. I will say one thing though, after we ported to alpha, we said no new code in macro. It was all C after that, unless, you got some blessing from God. Now, not only did we do all this stuff, we had to make assembler code compiler friendly. What did that really amount to? We went into every single routine, everywhere, and put a real call entry with register definitions in it, got to a return, and we tried to eliminate wherever we could any jumping between one quote unquote routine to another. So not only did we have to change all the code, we had to make the code so a compiler could look at it and say, this actually looks like code to me. Okay. When we ported to alpha, Nancy Cronenberg was our project leader. I will always consider Nancy my mentor at this point. And we had 6 or 7 project leaders. There was a IO project leader. There was an exec project leader. There was a Bliss project leader. there was a debugger project leader, and I was the Macro 32 project leader. Not responsible for the compiler. It was just kind of one piece of the Macro 32 picture. And then when we started out, I was the builder. After a build, I'd send out, I'd try to boot it. I get to a certain point. Okay, we crashed here. I put a breakpoint there, rebuild that image, put it on the kit. And I send out mail to all engineers saying, okay, you take today's build and you will get to this breakpoint. If you want to get beyond there, your mileage may vary. The other part of that was, you've heard of the expression, someone gives you a hot potato, put it in your hand, you want to get rid of it as soon as possible, right? We had a little red Nerf football, our hot potato. Once I sent out the message, I took the hot potato and I put it on the top of the cube of the person whose job it was to get beyond the breakpoint. And that's how we proceeded for a long time. This one changes. This is a notes file that I would make an entry as to the build announcement. And the person who had the hot potato, when they thought they got rid of the hot potato, could move to somebody else, they would go put the new image that would get you further than the breakpoint in that directory, and we proceeded. It was a very, you want to get rid of the hot potato, trust me. Oh, one more thing, yeah. I'm glad I made notes. I almost never make speaker notes. For some reason, Robert Hoffman, he was the 64-bit project leader. We used to call it Mr. Big. Somehow we latched onto TT Driver as something, this was going to be this is our whipping boy. The day we thought or could see the TT Driver would compile cleanly, we knew that this project might succeed. I mean, and I'm telling you, it was an aha moment. I can picture Robert sitting right next to me. We said, yes. But it was monumental to see a complicated Macro 32 module compile. Okay. EVAX, that was the internal name. We always knew it by extended VAX. Then we all started calling it alpha. Then we get down to the end of the road and all of a sudden we got problems. We can't use the alpha name. And its official name is AXP. Has anybody in this room ever said AXP? Right. Anyway, that was a big to-do when it came to actually releasing a product. And add that to VMS got changed to OpenVMS. At the same time, we were shipping alpha for the first time. So I'm sure that there may be still people today that think VMS runs on VAX and OpenVMS runs on alpha titanium. Marketing people get paid a lot of money.
The Sharon product that I'm in alpha is Sharon AXP. And Aerobe AXP, why is it Sharon alpha? Because
I'm right. I'm sure there's all sorts of examples, but yep, that's the way we ended. But ultimately, in I think it was 1992 somewhere, we did ship. Huge achievement, no doubt about it. But tons and tons of people involved, and that's my point. Tons and tons of people. When we started preparing for porting to x86, there were 10 of us.
Any truth to the rumor that AXP stood for almost exactly prison?
I've never heard that. Doug, you ever heard that? Nope, never heard that. Okay, onward. Titanium, different. Two companies. I don't know how many CEOs at this point, and the change in midstream, but I want to tell you about how we got started in VMS. Okay. This was a Monday. Friday afternoon, Mark Gorham, our VMS manager at that point, comes into my cube and says, let's go talk in a conference room for a minute. This is not unusual. We probably did this 2 or 3 times a week. We go in the room and Mark says, on Monday, the company is going to announce the VMS is going to be ported to Itanium. And no, he said, ported to Intel. And I said, okay. Monday, right? Monday, 2 days from now.
At least he didn't say put it on Monday.
Well, the reason he was telling me was, he was telling me on Friday afternoon, because on Monday, the big announcement was gonna make, but over the weekend, he and a bunch of managers were gonna call some key customers, not to get totally blindsided by this thing. You're already on one of the iconic systems on the planet, and we're gonna tell you to move. So he told me, because people know me and they're gonna send me mail and stuff. But then he said, go back to your office, clean up what you're doing, and go get out your Itanium manuals. And I said, what the hell is that? Because I thought he was talking about x86. So not only, and to my knowledge today, even today, I don't think the people who made this decision ever talked to a single engineer in VMS. And not only was it going to happen, they told us when we were going to ship it. Nothing like being dealt a hand where you have no idea where you're going, right? But so that was a big deal. That to me was a bigger deal in the fact that we were going to do it. This was as shocking to many people as the port of the operating system. EV7, well underway. EV8, more than just planning. This is the end of Alpha. Not just we're porting your operating system, we're taking your platform away from you. Why? This is hard to describe, but this is the way it was always described to us. And you don't really have to read all the words here, but the people, remember, we're now moving along here. We're now talking about compact. The only thing that matters on this slide right here is this line right here. The people who made this decision, and I know who they are, there were only 3 of them. They spent months talking to the Intel people. Probably HP a little involved here, but mostly Intel. And they all determined, being realistic they all were, and incredibly good engineers that we've known for a while, that it wasn't too long before Alpha was going to fall behind the curve. Everybody apparently agreed with this, and this is the reason that most of the big decisions were made right here, because they could see the time coming when the crossover was going to happen. Well, we're back to the macro 32 code again. What do? We did our due diligence again here, maybe better than we did the first time. Were there any tools that could actually look at this code and generate an C code? We're talking about a monster project here, but there are tools around to convert languages from one to the other all the time, right? But remember one of my previous slides, the current macro 32, at this time didn't look much like what you'd read in a manual, because we got all this other stuff in there that made it 64-bit knowledgeable. That was more than a minor problem, but we just never could convince ourselves that generated code was something that you could maintain, understand, and work with, regardless if we thought it would work. Bullet number 2, we're not making this mistake again. So, and this is why we say we build from common sources, because they are literally the same sources that we've built with since Alpha. And I was not letting that separation happen again. Verifying the conditionals is now a bigger job, because now it's not just VAX or Alpha, it's this other thing. It's no longer if this, else this. It's now you've got to consider 3 things. That's a lot of work. And if you've ever, for those of you in the company, if you ever look at the sources, every single line of code anywhere that has a conditional in it will have a comment at the end that says, verified for Alpha Port, Doug Gordon, verified for x86, Clair Grant, every single line, because that's how we found where they were. The list of places in the system is mind-boggling. I've had bigger spreadsheets than I can handle, but verifying the conditionals is a big deal. That's the first thing we did. Find them and make sure that what we're talking about here will work on this platform. And we really have stuck to the no 30 macro 32 source code. If you need to make a 2-line change somewhere, sure, but don't tell me you're going to write a 20-line, new routine. That gets done in C, and you call it. And we've been quite religious about that. Pretty good. But no matter what you're talking about, the elephant in the room is always the VAX macro code. Okay, Itanium being different. Yeah, there's lots of things that we had to think about. Remember, alpha, it kind of presented, because of the PAL code, it really presents itself as a VAX. How do we continue that without all that help in the firmware? Well, no matter what you do, you will have some amount of code in assembler for the platform you're on. You just can't get away from that. But we decided there's not going to be a compiler for the alpha assembler code that we had to have. And what we did was, now we're talking about a C compiler that we kind of owned. We had something that was workable, right? So we, along the way, had some more built-ins put in the compiler. We knew the compiler people, if we needed something, we could get it. So we reduced, going from alpha to Itanium, we reduced the amount of native assembler that's in the system. I can't tell you about how much, but a lot of the things that are in assembler on alpha have been rewritten in C, or at least modified enough so they're more understandable. And that was important. We made the default floating point IEEE. There's always the option to go back to, VAX floating point definitions. We're moving in the future, we're trying to get the customers to move there too. We didn't force it on them, but we made it, this is what you're going to get unless you say otherwise. And I think that worked pretty well. Who was it? This made a difference to very few people who chose to use it. I think it was FactSet. There was something that FactSet does in their calculations, like in the 7th decimal place or something like that. They noticed a difference. Okay, we figured that out. They figured it out. But making this the default had little negative effect, and we were very happy that, we kind of forced the customers to move on a little. No more PL1. There wasn't a big enough audience, whatever the rules were. Anyway, that was a decision. Had to affect somebody negatively, but we couldn't do everything. The next two on the bottom had massive effects on the time it took us to do the port. Those last two decisions to go with industry standard stuff, I can't tell you scientifically how much, but I can tell you that those last two bullets took months additional time on the port. Had effects in lots of places, but it moved us into the mainstream world, and we benefited from it greatly afterwards, and especially when it came to x86. So another thing, need to get into the mainstream. IEEE, industry standard stuff, wherever we could. And it allowed us to take advantage of a lot of other tools that came along. Oh, okay. Other thing massively different about porting to Itanium. When we ported to Alpha, it was ours. We in the company, we did it all. Compilers, hardware, we did it all. At this point, we started out porting Itanium, we were compact. Then we became HP. The day I heard that we were becoming HP, I said, there is a God. Compact didn't know what to do with us. And I can tell you, secondhand, but very reliably secondhand, Not too long after we were acquired from Compaq, we were this far from being cut loose. It was close. But they allowed us to continue long enough, thankfully, for HP to acquire Compaq, and we got kind of back into being on somebody's radar. We had tons of help. First bullet up there, the day after the announcement of HP acquiring us, I got a mail message from Dan Osecki, who was my counterpart in HP UX. Got to know Dan well over the years, and he said, talk to me, call me anytime you want. I can put you in touch with 10 engineers who have just done what you're about to do. We got enormous help from HP UX. Not only that, we contracted a bunch of people from EDS. They ported a lot of the layered products, a lot. And as it turns out, many of them previously worked in VMS, and some of them even ended up porting for us the code that they originally maintained or even wrote. We were not alone in this. True 64 was going to move to new architecture. And we hosted in Nashua a 3-day seminar with folks from Intel. They came and talked to us. And this is because we had that HP label on our chest now. We could request a few things because they had power. And we took great advantage of this. Even more. On Itanium, as probably most of you know, C++ came from Intel. Ada came from Adacore. The whole thing about the calling standard on VAX VMS, everything's on the stack. Anything you want to know, you can go look at the stack. Well, it doesn't work that way here. There's this thing called the unwind table, and you have to go fishing around and find stuff. HP UX had already done all this. So we took the HP UX code and adapted it in enough places that this is what is on Itanium. The binary translator, we didn't do that either. That's all right.
Well, now known as Strumps.
Now known as Stromises, correct. We did Alpha, yeah, we did it all. There's a math library that came from Intel. There's probably more things I could put on this list, but this is just another example of just how different porting to Itanium was. We got code, we got people to help us. Right. Do I have that up here? Yep. I thought I was going to have that up here. Okay. So some of the hard parts. There you go, Gary. One of the things about Itanium, okay, we always knew that underlying data was going to be a royal pain in the neck. We had no idea how bad it was going to be. So we had to deal with this. I don't know how many data structures we changed, how many layouts we realigned, but you had to go and really examine this because it has a huge performance impact. Ton of work. When we went to do the conditionals again, we kind of realized that, okay, I realized we had our heads down when porting to Alpha since we had the whole company depending on us. But we probably lacked a little foresight in the way we did some of the conditionals. Not enough of realizing that the product might be ported again. You know, sorry, you can probably blame me. However, we kind of had a hands full. And speaking of that, back in the Alpha days, one of the things that made you realize just how important this thing was, you would see people walking around in the halls of Spitwater you never saw up there. You know, Strecker, Demmer, people like that. They never crossed the border into New Hampshire that I know of. But they came to watch over us. So Nancy and I are walking down the hall one day, and behind us is, hey, wait up. Everybody remember Bob Supnick? Many of you know Bob. If not, from what he did, Sim H, maybe. He comes running down behind us. And I think Nancy said to him, hey, Bob, what are you doing up here in software land? And he said, well, we're creating a high performance, high quality system here. And I'm coming up here to make sure you software people don't screw it up. Now, yeah, people really know Bob. That's Bob, right? Right. Okay. And there was no kind of wink, wink, smile here. He was serious. We knew he was serious, and we knew he was serious. But that's the type of focus. The other part of that, not too long after that, still back in Alpha, Nancy and I were in a conference room one day talking about something. And this is near the end of the report. And she said to me, hope you've been taking good notes. Because if this is ever done again, you'll probably do it. So not only was she a brilliant engineer, she was a prophet, and not only once, but twice. So back to Gary's point. Okay, we lost the console that we've always had. And that's where EFI came into the world. Another thing, 2 stacks. What the heck is this register stack? Well, it has implications in a lot of places. So that caused a little bit of turmoil for a while, but and Doug can probably tell you a lot about kernel processes and such. But yeah, again, different. And this is the point where Burns Fisher created software interrupt services, which now Camille was the one who worked on this for x86. But this is that piece of code that kind of isolates the under platform from the rest of the system that doesn't care, but needs to know some things that are gleaned from what's in there.
So the system can keep believing it's running on the back.
Exactly. Now, you tell that to a customer sometimes, and they say, well, that's the stupidest thing in the world. Well, I'm sorry, that's where everybody started. So you're right, Swiss. If you have any questions about it, I'll ask Camille. That's what materializes the mythical VAX to all those pieces of software that weren't written back then that don't care. Licensing, I put this up here not because of the licensing itself, but what's in the parentheses. Being like XPUX was incredibly important. And that's because of the upper level parts of HP. When salesmen had to talk about operating systems, now they had this other new thing. They didn't want to be talking about it being different. They need to talk it in terms of licensing and marketing and documentation, like it's just another operating system like UX. Okay, that was enormously important. Okay. I was never a regular reader of Compo SVMS or the Inquirer. Just because I don't have time. I'm sorry. I'm sure it would be fun. I just don't have time. However, one of my favorite stories, people would often send me mail and say, you should go look at this thing that's going on in Compo SVMS. It was usually entertaining. Go look at this thing that's in the Inquirer. Okay, so new age term applied to lots of years ago. Yeah. Some of you probably know what's coming here. Yeah. How many remember this? Yeah. Okay. Great publicity. I mean, what's the line? I don't care what you say, as long as you spell my name right. We liked it, right? I probably know more about the code that created Itanium than anybody else. And to my best search, I believe the first time that anything was checked in that even closely came to mattering for Itanium was on the 14th of January. Now, whoever came up with this made it out of complete thin air. But it was fun. Oh, okay, onward. Who would ever have thought that after 5 years that there was going to be a reemergence of anything related to VMS? I didn't. I went to work for the CTO in HP Storage for 5 years, during which we acquired 4 companies: PolyServe, Left Hand Networks, iBricks and 3-part. We had our hands full. I had a great job and I worked for somebody I'd known for years. And all of a sudden, I get a mail message one day from Sue Skineski. She says, there's something going on you should know about. Send a message to Dwayne Harris. Okay, I did. 2 days later, Jim Janitos and I are down at the mnemonics offices talking to Dwayne. I'm drawing pictures on the whiteboard. I got people's names. I got diagrams all over the place. I mean, I've known how to port to x86 for 20 years. That was my very early beginning. And it all turned into this for me. And I'll tell you why. One, I had a little bit of a vision maybe, but this is the best word that I will always remember when I think of porting to x86, because it was the change. We didn't just need to get to a new platform. We need to get to a place where people were today. And I'll say a bit more here in a second. You've heard this 2 or 3 times in the last couple of days. VMS has been on the shelf in any way you want to think about it, and not just while it was India. It was before that for a lot of years. Just a gigantic task, no matter how you look at it. I could have put this in quotes and said Doug Gordon at the end, but I didn't. This is what Doug has been preaching since day one. Obviously right. Taking a look at it probably from a security perspective and a few other things. And I started thinking about this at a bigger level. Tried to look at it. Okay, Doug is certainly right, and I totally agree with it all. But something had changed. The world has gone virtual. Like it or not, I know there's always going to be bare metal tree huggers out there, and they've got their reasons. I understand that. But this is the way of the world. And I have a little story about what happened next. But Camille described the charter of the company in the beginning. Here's my version of it. What I was told, we're going to do one Itanium release to support IA6, which is where HP dropped the ball. Now, little did people know that before the code went to India, Burns had already checked in the support for i6. So when we got the code back, we did some work, I'll admit that, but 99% of what we had to do to satisfy bullet number 1 was already there. The bottom bullet is what I thought was going to happen. I think that's what we all thought was going to happen. And if you look at, okay, look at those 4 bullets. Only one of them happened. No maxes. We did multiple releases on Itanium. We've done multiple releases on Alpha. And it took a lot of people in the company, as small as we were, to ship products on these other platforms. No doubts about it. So we know how to do this at this point. Way back when in Alpha, Nancy created this thing called the Working Design Document, which had basically a chapter in it, a chapter in it for every project. And as I've learned over the years, she didn't just create that term out of thin air, because if you go back to I sent it to Drew, I think not long ago, I have a copy of the original VAX VMS project plan, and in it, there are references to the Working Design Document. And that's how we proceeded with Alpha. And I kind of took that model into moving to x86. You can read the details, but you've probably heard them 100 times. You port to a new piece of architecture, you're going to run into the same stuff pretty much all the time. Paging is going to be different. Exception handling is going to be different. I mean, you know what's coming unless there's something that falls out of the sky. And that's not going to happen on x86. It's been out there for 100 years, right? So this was the plan. It works. Take a look at, whoops, this and this. Can I actually prove that? Probably not, but I wrote this, I don't know how many decades ago, and I have no reason to disprove it. And in the beginning, I did this because we needed to show people that we weren't just tearing apart VMS. There were parts of it that, yes, we had to change, but it's really a small part. It really is. There's just tons and tons of parts of VMS that could care less what piece of hardware on. I mean, you can understand that. However, the thing I also say to people is, okay, 5% of the source code got changed. Okay, not too bad, right? Don't ever forget that 100% of the code has been recompiled and relinked. And that is often where we spend most of our time debugging. I mean, I couldn't tell you how many times I sat in my office and I'm single stepping my way through x86 instructions, Reagan standing behind me, looking for where did the compiler screw us today? The source code hadn't changed. So don't ever forget that. You may only think of it as a small amount of code change, but what's executing totally changed. Okay, I get to tell my favorite story. In the very early days, Burns and I, there's probably 10 of us, maybe a dozen at this point. So we're going to talk to Reagan. He's still working on, yeah, he was still working on non-study, I think. Yeah, he still was. So he's in our area. So Burns and John and I meet at Panera Bread up in Bedford. I've got an NDA with me. He signs it. And then we start talking. Now, this is not a good a story as Rod Cameron and a buddy of his drew a picture on a napkin and created Compact. It's not that good, but it's still pretty darn good. John starts drawing pictures. How are we going to do this? And he brought with us an incredible experience in that he'd just been working on nonstop. When in C, he said, I would never, ever do it like that again because they use GCC. He says, I will not go there. This is the way to go. And he drew a small version of what I ended up making this picture up here. This was one of the key things that we ever decided on x86 was going with LLVM. So once John joined us and Mike's wife, Linda, who was the former DEC C project leader, they started working on what we call G2L, the GEM to LLVM converter. See, we got this front end, GEM, it still knows everything. It produces a very legitimate internal language that compilers understand. This is the way compilers work. LLVM knows about its own internal representation for what's needed. So we had to just create the glue in the middle. Take what GEM had created for its internal representation, turn it into what LLVM needed, and on we go. Now,
That's so simple.
took the words right out of his mouth. However, you're talking about a lot of other things. The librarian, the linker, there's a whole bunch of other things here, not just what LLVM produces. And then, of course, you've got the elephant in the room again. What do we do with macro? And while it uses some facets of LLVM, not the code generator, it does its own thing like it always has. So LLVM, in fact, has an interface for things like that. It's the, I know what I'm doing interface. So macro is different, even though there are LLVM aspects to it. Everything we've done has this underneath it. Okay. We actually, John and I, and a couple others, we actually thought about this again. Is there something that would generate code that would get rid of this macro stuff? And we concluded no, again. John loves to give everybody $1 for rewriting the
He
module.
never pays.
I didn't know that. I'm going to stop telling that story. I didn't know that. Okay,
He
but,
always says he will, but he never does.
so I want to tell you one other thing about that first bullet. We talk to people. There are companies who convert things from one language to another. And everybody wants to say, oh, I'll convert your Bliss code though. I don't care. Bliss is a perfectly fine language. It compiles. We don't have to touch it. Okay. Pro, here is, if there's one thing in x86 is a thorn in my side, this is it. It doesn't have a probe instruction. I mean, this is fax era architecture, and it doesn't have a probe instruction like all the other platforms that we run on. So there's this module called emulate probe that Burns wrote, started earlier. In fact, he tested it on VAX for a while. I mean, on Alpha. We have to jump through sorts of hoops to do this. I mean, a simple probe, and Camille described some of it this morning. When it's so cheap and so easy on VAX where it all started, you just do a probe, you know, inexpensive. Tell me what the answer is. We can't do that. There's nothing there. So we have page tables upon page tables and protections. And Drew has probably described a lot of that. Camille said a few words this morning. But of all the things that we're looking at right now, we finally are going to tackle this thing in some way, because we've known it's on the list. We just never had time to do it. Well, it's kind of my job at the moment. Oh, my job. I'm no longer the CEO. I work for Camille, essentially. He and I decide what I do on a part-time basis that will most beneficial to the company. Well, this is my current thing, performance. Running in 2 modes. Okay, this sounds horrible, but we had actually thought about this before. Toyed with it a little bit because even on Itanium, it doesn't really have the full protection set that VAX and Alpha do. We kind of fake a couple of things on Itanium even. But so this is not a new concept to us, but here you go. Again, page tables for processes, whole 9 yards. Another thing, x86 doesn't have the 8K page size, which everything in VMS counts on, has forever. So we had to choose, what are we going to do? And this is what we came up with. Difficult, sure. Didn't turn out to be that bad though. And we ran into things along the way that probably unanticipated, but here we are. Seems to be good. But that was we had to decide what to do here. So we had to pick something. LLVM, I mentioned earlier, and it's not just the compiler. It's not just the back end. There are tools. There are all sorts of things that once you get into the LLVM open source world, there's a whole bunch of stuff there that you can take advantage of. There are major companies in the world that have moved to LLVM. You hear about them all the time. John goes to their conference. So it's one of those things where the world in general will move us forward if we just pay attention and take what they give us. Okay, you've heard a little about these things already. New boot manager, Gary's presentation yesterday. Always boot from memory disk. There's a little bit of a story here. I was in Burns's office one day, right across the top. And Doug was talking to somebody about the info server and how it worked. And Burns and I probably weren't paying that much attention, but a little later in the day, we said, why don't we boot this way all the time? Whether it's a disk or the network or the info server, why do we do all this jumping through hoops to boot a different way depending on the device? That was kind of the birth of the memory disk in a way. And as I was talking to some people yesterday, this could be my favorite project of all time. Difficult, sure. Are we still struggling with it a little bit? But it's just one of those things that made so much sense. How come we didn't think about this before? No more writing boot drivers and all that sort of stuff. So, and the dump kernel kind of fell out of a need once the memory disk came into play. It too, very complicated, granted, but it was just part of the package. It's the way it works. early on in according to x86, Drew, Mr. Sisboot at that time, we had no idea when we were going to have a compiler, let alone a Bliss or a macro compiler. However, EFI had always been done on Visual Studio. So Drew rewrote Sysboot in C and developed it on Visual Studio. So we had something. The way the system works, I mean, the boot manager is a thing all by itself. It doesn't know about operating systems really. Sysboot is kind of a standalone operating system in a sense. So we had something that we could start debugging on. As Gary pointed out in the boot manager talk, a lot of the boot manager commands are for analysis. You know, what the heck is this system about? And we use it that way. But then we could get up into Sysboot with the C version that had been created on Visual Studio. That took us another step. Other things we did in x86. I didn't know what to put up here for a title, but there are just some things that we thought should be done sometime in VMS, and this might be the only time to do them. First bullet, probably should have done that sometime in the past, but we need to get the operating system out of the way.
I'm scared of it, it should be P2.
Oh, yes, thank you, thank you. Thought I was gonna make it all without a mistake. You're right, and adding pool. Bigger, more of it. I think the network is going to take advantage of the expanded pool. More messages, bigger messages, more traffic. Oh yeah, right? Dave Fairbanks talked about IOVD, another part of bigger, better, help performance, make things better. No swapping, not a big deal. However, everybody has so much memory now. Who cares about swapping, right? What's the saying? Disk don't cost much and memory is free.
Well, his husband, I more.
Okay, yep. Anyway, that was another thing. I told you before that we took the unwind table stuff from HPUX. We didn't want to do that again. We wanted again, get into the open source, get more things that the community contributes that we can take advantage of. So the portable unwind table front library from open source is in the next release, I think. I don't think it's in the current one. I think it's going to be in the next one. But that's another move for getting more help from the outside world, which we need, for sure.
That's too cool on my team.
Okay. Okay. I need another story here. The trip we took to Germany, I did a presentation. I think it was a Connect conference. Anyway, I'm looking at, I don't know, 100 people. I know pretty much every single face in the audience. Was anybody there, by the way? You can back me up that I'm not telling any lies here. I did my usual pitch, you know, here's how we're going to port it. Here's the right? Any questions? So I'm standing up there. I can still see this guy today, right there. I wish I'd gone up and asked his name afterwards. He got up and the first thing out of his mouth was, when are you going to run on VMware? I gave some probably politically correct answer, but inside I'm going, yes. And then he went on to say, the reason I'm saying this is, don't be different. You've probably heard me say that a few times too. Because the explanation was the usual one. I go to my IT folks, I get this titanium thing over the corner, costs zillions of dollars, no one knows anything about it. But if I go to my IT folks and say, give me 2 guests on your VMware host, I'll get it. That was the message, and every single person in the room was nodding their head. So I knew we had a vision that if we could ever get there, was probably going to be the right one. We started out, once we got to the point where we got something that would run on x86 at all, started to move on. Most of us had MacBooks, put VirtualBox on it. Some people had PCs on there too, and that's where we started. And you realized immediately, I realized immediately at least, crashes, goes back up in like 10 seconds, right? How did I live without this for 35 years? Then we moved KVM. We started out with CentOS, probably, I don't know, version 7 or something. DL380, yep. That's where we started with KVM. And we immediately, all people, immediately moved on to Ubuntu and Debian and Rocky. You know, you name it. Everybody's got their favorite thing. And if we hadn't tried it ourselves, I know lots of people did. So KVM became a pretty prevalent thing and is for a lot of us today. But the goal was ESXi. No question about it. Although we understand that KVM popularity is growing now and has been for a while. And the whole Broadcom thing changes everything for a lot of people. So we expect KVM to become more prevalent, even more so than we were originally anticipating. So finally got to at least working on VMware. And of course, we had to, the bottom, we had to do Intel and AMD processors. I've been around the higher levels of HP enough to know that they sell a ton of AMD processors just because they cost less. In the beginning, once we got to the point where we had something we could actually tell people to try, as limited as it was, I sent out a questionnaire to, I think it was every customer we had at the time. Got back the responses. And questions like, do you use DECnet? What compilers do you use? Do you care about documentation? Stuff like that. So I started out with 5, anywhere from SCI in here. Number 1, the first people outside of ESI to run on x86. Had to, pick friendly people in the beginning. So added 5, kind of every 6 weeks, maybe closer to 8 weeks, but there was a very regular pace of adding 5 more people for quite a while. Because as we got more things working, I could go back at my questions and see who needed what, and is it now available and it wasn't before. Somebody's waving their hand.
No, I was one of the.
You were one.
90G.
Yep. Also needed to work with people who we knew would get honest feedback. And Jim was one of those people. Okay, very limited. I mean, there was a whole list of things we didn't have. Okay, but people understood that. These were people who knew what was coming, and we kind of relied on them to help us. We got to VirtualBox and KVM fairly early in this process of adding 5 people every couple of months or so. Still no VMware. And when we started, we hadn't even approached the VMS regular installation procedure, so we shipped appliances. I still think there is some place in VMS's future for shipping a product as an appliance. I can't put my finger on it, but just
the command procedure I sent you?
I probably have something similar, if not yours. But anyway, it's just so nice and so convenient. You don't have to know a darn thing. This drawback is it creates a new VM every time. And once you've gotten into the mode, you don't want to do that. But as a beginner, I mean, it's just so slick.
The only thing you messed me up on was you kept slipping a lab. And that forced me to write my 4th drive.
Okay. I may need some info from Gary here, but we struggled, and I mean struggled, with getting up on VMware. Even after conquering VirtualBox and KVM, they were kind of the same. We didn't have to think too hard about big differences, but all of a sudden, whoa, we're getting nowhere. And you found this guy in a public conference, I don't even know which one, and asked him questions, and all of a sudden, I'm the VMware ACPI guy, and he's answering Gary's questions.
But between being overrun by frogs and fires, this guy from Australia, I showed him a little sympathy. Became a good friend.
Yeah, I mean, this is someone, I don't even know who it is. He deserves more than a mug and a t-shirt, trust me. And there's, as Gary described yesterday, there's this thing that happens at the end of EFI. EFI is essentially a standalone application. And it goes through this thing called exit boot services. I hope I get this right. So we do this on every platform, but we just could not figure out why we couldn't get from here to sysboot in the way we're supposed to, right? Well, it turns out that ESXi has some, I'm going to say, assumptions about what is left in memory after exit boot services that the others don't. We just could not get there, but we did after the magic happened.
It actually exits rather than kind of exits.
Okay? But anyway, we struggled, but we finally got there. You've probably heard all of this at this point. Yeah, we need to finish the native port. We need to get to native builds. We're working on performance analysis, and we have incorporated, meshed together two things to update our instruction decoder to get up to date with some of the Intel things. And there are others which Tamil can tell you all about and has already to some degree. Okay. Two more things. Maybe not too related to this, but this could be the last time I ever do this, talking about porting anything. So I'm going to diffuse one question right off the bat. Is VMS ever going to be ported again? I'm the wrong person to ask because I've been notoriously wrong twice in both directions. So what I will tell you is, if it ever is, it won't be by me. There aren't too many people who have ever looked through the VMS source code as much as I have. You come across some incredibly interesting comments, some of which I wouldn't make public, but some of them are pretty entertaining. You know, this line, you know, I fixed the thing that I broke in the previous edit, quote unquote. How could I have been so stupid? Well, things like that happen. However, my favorite entry in any edit history that I've ever seen, and it was after a regular edit made a change, is this. And I think it expresses something that many of us feel, even if you never worked on VMS itself. It's a message there. This product makes a lot of people feel that way. In the beginning, I didn't have the bottom line on there. However, Tom Caffarel is a good friend of mine, known him for ages, and many of you probably do. One of the nicest guys you'll ever work with. I'm sure he will be proud to have people see that more than just those of us looking at the source code. Right? One more thing. Personal note here. Yes, I retired from my previous job. Done, doing something different now. We had a retirement luncheon and all that stuff. And I sent out a message the next day to a bunch of people. And you get something more than a three sentence paragraph from me, you know it's important. So here's the first paragraph near the end. This is a message to people at DSI, but I want all of you to appreciate what's coming here. It's a hell of a story. Be around this afternoon, tomorrow. I'll take a few questions now, but I know we're bumping on lunch here.
Well, lunchtime is about 20 minutes ago.
Okay, go for it.
Thank you, that was.
Thank you.